Hi, welcome back. In the second section of his essay on the enchantment of the state, Sudipta Kaviraj discusses about the colonialism and the early modern state in India. He begins this section by drawing our attention to the suggestion made by some historians on the process of early modernity. This process was partly speeded up and partly negated by the arrival of colonialism through its institutional forms from modern Europe. Beyond merely pointing out on the process of early modernity, Kaviraj did not give any space or elaborate that process. That's a bit of disappointing, as one would like to know more about early modernity, particularly forms and the effects of that process. But in an essay of this nature, I don't think it will be easy to cover all those, particularly the essay is about state, and talking about modernity will consume a lot of time and space, obviously. That aside, three important aspects of the section 2 are: first, the way the British conquered or occupied India; second, the colonialist attitude towards the colonized, or simply the British attitude towards the people of India; and finally, the way the Indians have responded to the colonialism and some of their policies. Let's take up the first aspect, the way the British conquered or occupied India. British colonial power entered India in an unusual manner. Unlike other conquerors that came from outside India, say Alexander the Great during the ancient times or Muslims during the medieval times, the British did not enter Indian society as a conquering colonial power. For the sake of clarity, one can divide the British involvement in India during the 18th century into two phases, one ending and the other beginning at the mid 18th century. In the first half of the 18th century, the British were a trading presence at certain points along the coast, such as Surat, Masilipatam, Madraspatam, etc. From the 1750s, they began to wage war on land in eastern and southeastern India and to reap the rewards of successful warfare, which was the exercise of political power. By the end of the 18th century, British rule had been consolidated over the first conquests, and it was being extended up to the valley of Ganges to Delhi and over most of the peninsula of southern India. By then, the British had established a military dominance that would enable them in the next 50 years to subdue all the remaining Indian states of any consequence, either conquering them or forcing their rulers to become subordinate allies. In a way, as Kaviraj noted, secrecy, stealth and imperceptibility or quietness were the conditions of the British conquest in India. 2 points of interest here are: first, the British were eventually able to conquer India precisely because they did not conquer it at all at once. And as Kaviraj mentions, the entire process, at least initially, did not look like a conventional imperial conquest. Second, the British did not conquer an India which existed before their conquest. Rather, they conquered a series of independent kingdoms that became political India during their rule. That is to say that India became India mainly because of the British dominion in India. As the British took a long time to conquer and bring many independent kingdoms under their suzerain, and also deployed numerous methods such as the deployment of military power and diplomacy to become subordinate allies, their assumption of various functions of state, such as ensuring internal peace and security, defense against foreign attack, protection of the rights of the people and others, also did not take place in one go. the British assumed the functions of a state at various spells. For instance, as the East India Company established its hold over specific levels of the economy and administration of various regions of India, it introduced in segments and as and when its requirements demanded various military and administrative functions to its tremendous collection of diverse activities. As the colonial power began to bring in more and more Indian territory under its control, and as it obtained further permission to collect revenue on behalf of the Mughal Empire, it brought the accounting practices in place. Mind you that permission to collect revenue was in addition to the legal permission or the famana that the East India Company has already secured from the Mughal Emperor. The company's revenue collection activities and the required accounting practices in turn led to greater cultural contact with the native population, which in turn resulted in colonial authorities' cautious cultural moves to introduce the natives to modern education. On and all, it took more than 70 years for the British power to place new ruling practices that came to form the recognizable figure of a colonial state. Interestingly, when the British power was finally consolidated, the state that emerged was something of an intermediate form. As Kaviraj states, it was a hybrid between empire state of the older type and a sovereign state in the European pattern. For example, while some of its features came to demonstrate distinct marks of the relation of sovereignty that binds subjects to their sovereign state authority, its colonial character prevented it from developing other aspects of a state of sovereignty. In other words, the British Empire or the Indian state under the British was fundamentally different from its Mughal predecessor. That is to say, the nature of its power, the purpose for which it was used, and its long-term historical consequences were all immeasurably different from earlier empire states. Excuse me. For instance, to elaborate this point further, prior to the emergence of the British Empire, India had witnessed empires both in the ancient and medieval periods. Maurya Empire, Gupta Empire, Empire of Harsha, Kushan Empire during the ancient times, Delhi Sultanate and Mughal Empire in medieval times are some examples. Now, rulers of these empires, whether originally from India or came from outside, they all settled down in India, and the taxes they collected from the people were used for the development of the subjects. At least money was not being taken outside the country. But in the case of the British Empire, it was completely a different picture. A major portion of the money collected through taxes was sent to England, which facilitated the development of the company, officials and shareholders initially, and later on the development of the United Kingdom. At this point, it may be useful to point out how the British justified their rule in India. After the British consolidated their power in India, except for the remote and distant regions in the northwest, most of the Indian subcontinent came under their stable, single and uniform administrative authority. Because of this uniformity in administration, and also on account of the unprecedented supremacy of the British in military technology, the colonial rule gave a new kind of fixity to political territoriality in India. On account of this territorial fixity, the British were compelled to place moral claims of sovereign power. As Kaviraj points out, while in European discourse, the British rule in India was often justified by a dubious right of conquest, inside India, their justification was ideologically anchored more effectively in a typically utilitarian line of reasoning. Interestingly, the British, the colonial master, has agreed that the legitimacy of a government should be judged consequentially, but that judgment should not be from the standpoint of view of some vague and indeterminable right of native to rule, but from the standpoint of view of the historical results of a form of governance. Surely, by this criterion of the form of governance, it was possible to provide an effective justification of colonial rule. Interestingly, it was James Mill who came up with this justification. James Mill argued that so long as the business of India's government was well and cheaply performed, it was of little or no consequence who are the people that perform it. This means the British were conducting the business of India's government effectively and importantly at a low cost. As long as the end of the government is achieved, that is, protection of individuals and property, it is absolutely does not matter whether India was run by the Indians themselves or the British. Now, having looked at the first aspect, the way the British have conquered or occupied India, in the second section, let's take up the second point from the same. Let's take up the same point. Second point. That is the colonial attitude towards the colonized, or simply the British attitude towards the people of India. The British rulers' attitude towards their subjects was not consistent throughout their rule in India. From time to time, it has undergone several changes. Broadly, their attitude towards Indians need to be seen from two historical contexts, that is, prior to the Sepoy Mutiny and after the Sepoy Mutiny. Therefore, first let's look at the British attitude towards Indians before the Sepoy Mutiny. During the early colonial period, the British policy had been that of an acknowledgement of the alienness of the British power. They showed an excessive anxiety over interference in the social habits of their Indian subjects. Although such non-interference was justified on the grounds of Roman precedents, the real reason behind the British anxiety over interference in the social habits of the Indians was that of fear of triggering a rebellion. The British particularly tried to distance themselves from interfering in the religious domain of the Indians by distinguishing the religious from the secular. They made an effort to confine the activities of the state, what they considered secular affairs, and consequently withdrew from the religious activities such as managing of Hindu temples and the Muslim shrines. Interestingly, this was quite contrast with the practice in England, where the established church drew its support from the state. But the colonial rulers' cautious non-interference in the internal affairs of their Indian subjects had to be changed from the middle of the 19th century, particularly following the large-scale rebellion of 1857, which the British called Sepoy Mutiny, and in part as its consequence, the character of the colonial rule changed in many ways. First, the government in London, or the Queen Victoria of United Kingdom, assumed the direct responsibility of the Indian Empire, abandoning the earliest policy of ambivalent exploitation of the colonial connection. That is to say, when the British East India Company was ruling India, British official policy was a mixture of quiet enjoyment of the financial benefits of company rule and a casual denial of responsibility if things went wrong. But with the direct assumption of empire by the British home government, the colonial establishment had to be more directly involved in the affairs of the colony, and as Kaviraj notes, it had to take far more seriously progressive demands that emerging liberal rules of governance should be applied to the government of India. Secondly, colonial authorities recognized the need for Indian collaboration, a collaboration that would bring a group of modernist Indians into the business of colonial administration in subordinate roles. The main expectation from these modernist Indians was that they could work to provide an ideological relay into the Indian society. Excuse me. Now, let's take up the final aspect from section 2, which is the way the Indians have responded to the colonialism. As noted earlier, the British took nearly 70 years to establish the empire in India. As the gradual expansion of the British Empire did not look like a conventional imperial conquest, and also as the colonial rulers did not interfere in the social habits of their Indian subjects, except the royal families that lost their kingdoms and the Mughals who lost their empire to the British, the ordinary people of the subcontinent were not affected by the British conquest. Despite the enormity of violence, the Sipahi Mutiny of 1857 was a failed rebellion both ideologically and politically, because except for a small revivalist Muslim elite in northern India which believed in the vague possibility of a return to Mughal power, the rebellion received hardly any support from the ordinary people. The majority of the peasantry were too alienated from the world of political power to respond. Some of the intellectuals, particularly the modernist elites based in Calcutta, who could visualize the overall impact of colonial rule over India, did not raise voice against the colonial authority. Their silence was majorly because they saw their economic prosperity and their control over the Indian society in the expansion of the British Empire in India. Kaviraj, taking the abolition of Sati as a case, tried to explain the Bengal intelligentsia's response to the colonial rule. For those of you who are not familiar with the practice of Sati, the practice of Sati is originally derived from the name of the goddess Sati, who immolated herself because she was unable to bear her father Daksha's humiliation towards her husband Shiva. Sati now is an antiquated funeral custom among Hindu communities where recently widowed women either voluntarily or by force immolates or sacrifices herself on her deceased husband's pyre or takes her own life in another fashion. Such death is known as Anumarana. It appears the practice have originated within the warrior aristocracy among the Hindus in the northern part of the Indian subcontinent and gradually gained in popularity from the 10th century through the 18th century. Sati was regarded as a barbaric practice by the Islamic rulers of the Mughal period. Particularly in the 16th century, Humayun, the second Mughal emperor, was the first to issue a royal decree against the practice. Akbar was next to issue official orders prohibiting Sati, and since then it was done voluntarily by women. In his orders, Akbar also issued orders that no woman could commit Sati without specific permission from his chief police officer. Akbar also instructed the officers to delay the women's decision for as long as possible. During the East India Company's rule, under a sustained campaign against the Sati by Christian missionaries such as William Carey and the Brahmin Hindu reformers such as Raja Ram Mohan Rai, the then Governor General Lord William Bentinck on 4th December 1829 banned the Sati practice through the Bengal Sati regulation in all jurisdiction of British India. That aside, the Sati episode illustrates the emergence of attitudes that were to characterize the Indian political discourse for a long time. Kaviraj brings to our attention the way the Indian intellectuals and public opinion split into three different camps. These camps illustrated the divided attitudes of the Indians towards their colonial masters. The first camp, represented by people like Raja Ram Mohan Rai, while extending unconditional support for the abolition of sati, argued that since Hindu society was unwilling to abolish the practice, the only rational solution to the problem was to bring in the power of the colonial state. They further argued that rationalist reform was a historical necessity, even though such reform results in the colonial intervention into Indian social practice. Excuse me. The second camp, represented by people like Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyaya or Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, despite agreeing that sati was a morally abhorrent practice, they do not want any sort of colonial intervention in the social practice of the Hindus. They justified their position against the colonial intervention by stating that to allow the colonial state to rectify the undoubted barbarisms of indigenous society as a way of giving it an illegitimate jurisdiction for interference without consultation, and also going against the fundamental notions of self-rule. The third camp of Hindu opinion was articulately conservative. This camp opposed the jurisdiction of the state to initiate reform and rejected normative criticism of sati as a social practice. In addition to these three positions, the Indian intellectual reflection on the peculiarities of imperial control during the later half of the 19th century and early part of the 20th century revolved around two main questions. The first one relating to the question of subjugation. How such a small number of alien rulers from a distant base could control a country of such immense size and diversity. By the early 20th century, the question of subjugation was transformed into the question of independence. How the British power could be effectively contested and ultimately removed seemed to have occupied the intellectual reflection. The first question relating to the subjugation of Indians by the alien rulers from a distant base appears to have went through several stages, and Indian intellectuals eventually provided increasingly complex and political answers to this major puzzle of modern Indian history. For our purpose, one version of explanation was focused on military technology and organization of the colonial rulers. But Indian rulers like Tipu Sultan of Mysore was also employed European military organization and technology. Yet, eventually he had to succumb to the British power. In other words, military technology and organization was not a plausible explanation. It was at this point of implausible explanations that the Indian intellectuals' discussions moved towards a more sociological form of analysis. An analysis that suggests that the obvious invincibility of British power arose not from material things like superior technology or simply organization of the British armed forces, but from their national spirit, which is something deeper, more comprehensive and subtle. What the Indian intellectuals meant by national spirit was modern nation state, which produced a new constitutive relationship between a people and their state. Kaviraj notes that early Indian nationalist thinking was full of references to the virtues of discipline, which was what the British possessed and the Indians lacked. It was in this fashion, as Kaviraj noted, with a strange contradictory relation with European nation state that the Indian nationalism was born. The Indian intellectuals felt that it was only by generating a sense of nationalism among the Indians that the colonial grip of the British nation state on its Indian empire can be removed. Before we wind up our discussion on section 2, let's summarize main aspects of the section. This section's main focus was around three aspects. Firstly, the way the British conquered or occupied India. Secondly, the colonial rulers' attitude towards their Indian subjects. And finally, the way the Indians have responded to the colonial rule. With regard to the first aspect, we have noted that the British have employed both their military power and diplomatic skills in colonizing India. As they have taken nearly 70 odd years to bring a major portion of the Indian territory under their control, their conquest did not look like an imperial conquest at all. Regarding the second aspect, the colonial rulers' attitude towards their Indian subjects. As the British attitude towards Indians underwent several changes over the course of their rule, we have taken 1857, the era of Sepoy Mutiny, as the deciding year. We looked at the British attitude prior to the Sepoy Mutiny and after the mutiny, during which time the British government in London began to take direct control over the Indian Empire. While in the first phase, the British were cautious as to not to interfere in the social habits of their subjects and distinguished between the religious sphere from that of the secular sphere. The second phase, they tried to apply liberal principles in their governance in India and sought the Indian collaboration in the administration of the British Empire. The final point of section 2 is that of Indian response to colonial rule. Taking the British intervention on the issue of Sati as an example, we have noted three positions of the Indian intellectuals and public opinion towards colonialism. Well, the first camp insisted on taking the support of the colonial power. This camp was more or less in favor of the colonial rule. The second camp vehemently criticized the colonial rule. The third camp was represented by the Hindu conservative forces, have rejected the colonial intervention in the social affairs of the Indians. Apart from this, we have also noted intellectual reflections on the colonial rule in India. Well, until the 19th century, the Indian intellectuals were majorly concerned with the question of subjugation. From the early 20th century onwards, they were concerned with the question of independence. Although initially the Indian intellectuals came up with the explanation of the British superior military technology and organization as the reason for the subjugation, eventually they felt that it was the national spirit of the British that led to their victory and eventual occupation of India. The Indian intellectuals felt that it was only through generating a sense of nationalism that Indians can eliminate the colonial grip of the British nation state. I shall end here. In the next clip, we shall take up other sections. Thank you.